You kept me waiting a very long time, Miss Bennet. The words were spoken so quietly that Rosalie Bennet almost believed she had imagined them, yet the man who had uttered them was still standing before her beneath the golden chandeliers of Harrogate Hall, watching her with the unsettling stillness of someone who had crossed 18 years to arrive at precisely this moment. Only minutes earlier, Rosalie had been enduring Lady Beatrice Holloway's polished cruelty beside the ballroom windows, where rain tapped softly against the glass and hundreds of candles turned the October darkness outside into a black mirror. 27 and still unmarried, Lady Beatrice had remarked, smiling behind her ivory fan. One begins to wonder whether Miss Bennet has rejected marriage, or marriage has rejected Miss Bennet. Several nearby guests had laughed. Rosalie had not. She merely lifted her chin, smoothing one gloved hand over the faded blue silk of her gown. Briar Glen Orchard had suffered 2 poor harvests, and expensive dresses belonged to another life now, but poverty had not yet taught Rosalie to surrender her dignity. Perhaps, she answered calmly, some women would rather remain unmarried than become unhappy merely to satisfy an audience. Lady Beatrice's smile tightened. Then the great doors opened. Conversation thinned into silence as the butler announced, His Grace, Everett Whitmore, Duke of Alderwick. Rosalie turned with everyone else. The man entering the ballroom was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed almost entirely in black. Nothing about him demanded attention, yet attention followed him anyway. Men straightened. Women lowered their voices. Even Lady Beatrice stopped smiling. Rosalie had heard the rumors. Alderwick had returned to Cumberland after years abroad. He possessed estates stretching across miles of northern countryside, investments whispered about in London drawing-rooms, and an influence powerful enough to make men who had never met him speak carefully when using his name. Yet none of that was what held Rosalie's gaze. It was his face. A pale scar traced one side from near his temple toward his cheek, visible beneath the chandelier light. He made no attempt to conceal it. There was something almost defiant in that refusal. His gray eyes moved across the ballroom with cool indifference until they reached Rosalie. Then he stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. A servant carrying champagne nearly crossed his path before realizing the Duke was no longer moving. Rosalie felt an inexplicable chill. She had never met Everett Whitmore. She was certain of it. Yet the Duke looked at her as though he knew the sound of her childhood laughter. As though he remembered things about her that she herself had forgotten. Lady Beatrice leaned closer. How extraordinary, she whispered. He appears to be staring at you. Rosalie wished he were not. The Duke crossed the room. Guests quietly moved aside, creating a path he had never asked them to make. Rosalie became aware of the rain, the orchestra falling silent between songs, the faint scent of beeswax and autumn roses, and the ridiculous pounding of her own heart. Everett stopped before her. Up close, his scar was more pronounced, but his expression was unreadable. Miss Bennet. Rosalie curtsied. Your Grace. Something flickered behind his eyes at the formality. Disappointment, perhaps. But that made no sense. Have we met? She asked. For one suspended second, the powerful Duke of Alderwick looked almost wounded. Then the expression vanished. Not in any way you remember. Rosalie searched his face. There was something familiar in the shape of his eyes, something buried beneath years she could not reach. Everett's hand disappeared briefly inside his coat. His fingers closed around something unseen before he released it again. A pocket watch, though Rosalie could not know that. Nor could she know that beneath its silver cover remained a narrow blue ribbon, faded almost gray with 18 winters. Lady Beatrice cleared her throat, suddenly eager to be noticed. Everett did not look at her. His attention remained entirely on Rosalie. You kept me waiting a very long time, Miss Bennet. Her breath caught. Waiting for what? For the first time that evening, something almost like warmth entered his cold gray eyes. A promise. Before Rosalie could answer, he bowed and walked away, leaving her beneath the trembling candlelight with one forgotten image rising inexplicably from the deepest chamber of her memory. A lonely boy beneath a hawthorn tree, hiding one side of his face, while a little girl tied a blue ribbon around an old silver watch and promised him something she had been far too young to understand. 18 years earlier, before titles and ruined harvests and the quiet disappointments of adulthood had taught Rosalie Bennet to distrust promises, there had been a summer when the world seemed no larger than Briar Glen, the neighboring Whitmore estate, and the green hills rolling toward the Cumberland mountains. Rosalie was 9 years old then, a pale, bright-eyed child with chestnut hair that never remained properly pinned and an inconvenient habit of wandering wherever adults had forbidden her to go. Everett Whitmore was 11, solemn beyond his years, and already accustomed to watching other children turn curious eyes toward the pale scar that crossed the left side of his face. Rosalie had first noticed him during a summer gathering at the Whitmore estate. While the other children raced across the lawn, Everett remained beneath an old hawthorn tree near the boundary wall, turning a silver pocket watch slowly between his fingers. She had approached him carrying 2 apples stolen from a basket in her aunt's kitchen. "Would you like one?" she asked. Everett looked suspiciously at the apple, then at her. "Why?" "Because I have 2. That answer seemed to confuse him more than kindness would have. She sat beside him without waiting for permission. For several minutes they ate in silence while bees drifted lazily through the clover and sunlight moved across the old stone wall. Rosalie did not ask about his scar. That was why Everett remembered her. Everyone else eventually asked. Over the weeks that followed, the hawthorn became theirs. Rosalie would walk nearly a mile from Briar Glen whenever she could escape her lessons, and Everett would be waiting with his pocket watch, a book, or some strange fact he had discovered in his father's library. He knew the names of constellations. She knew where wild strawberries grew beside the creek. He could identify birds by their calls. She could make him laugh, though he always seemed surprised afterward, as if laughter were something his face had forgotten how to do. One afternoon in late August, Rosalie found him sitting beneath the hawthorn with his back against the trunk. His pocket watch rested closed in his palm. "You missed lunch," she said. "I was not hungry." "You are always hungry." Everett said nothing. Rosalie sat beside him. She had learned that silence sometimes opened doors questions could not. Eventually he spoke. "Do you think someone can be ugly forever?" Rosalie frowned. "That is a foolish question." "You did not answer it." Everett turned his face slightly away from her. Earlier that day, several visiting children had whispered about his scar. Rosalie had heard enough to understand why he had disappeared from the lawn. "I think people can be foolish forever," she said. Everett almost smiled. Almost. Then his expression grew serious again. "No girl will ever want to marry someone who looks like me." Rosalie stared at him with the absolute certainty available only to children. Marriage, to her, meant sharing breakfast, walking through gardens, and having someone who would save the best apples for you. She could imagine no sensible reason why a scar should matter. "I will marry you." Everett looked at her. "What?" "Someday. When we are old enough." "You cannot promise something like that." "I just did." For the first time, Everett laughed without trying to stop himself. Rosalie smiled triumphantly and reached into the pocket of her dress. She pulled out a narrow blue ribbon she had removed from her hair that morning. "Give me your watch." "Why?" "Because promises need something to remember them by." He surrendered the silver watch. Rosalie carefully tied the ribbon around its chain, making an uneven knot that took 3 attempts before satisfying her. When she placed it back into his hand, Everett stared at the blue ribbon as though she had given him something far more valuable than silk. "Now you cannot forget," she said. His fingers closed around the watch. "I will not." The evening bells sounded faintly from Briar Glen, calling Rosalie home. She stood, brushed grass from her dress, and ran several steps before turning. Everett remained beneath the hawthorn, watching her. "Tomorrow?" she called. "Tomorrow," he answered. But tomorrow came with gray skies and locked gates. Rosalie walked the familiar mile to the Whitmore estate, and found no Everett beneath the hawthorn. The servants did not answer the side entrance. Curtains had been drawn across every window. By afternoon, wagons were carrying trunks away. She waited until dusk, convinced Everett would appear and explain everything. He never did. And when Rosalie finally returned home through the gathering mist, she did not know that somewhere beyond those Cumberland hills, an 11-year-old boy sat inside a departing carriage with an old silver pocket watch pressed tightly between his hands, a blue ribbon tied around its chain, and one impossible promise becoming the last beautiful thing he believed belonged entirely to him. By sunrise, the Whitmore estate looked less like a home abandoned than a memory someone had tried to erase. Rosalie returned before breakfast, her boots damp from the mile-long walk through silver morning mist, certain that Everett had simply forgotten their meeting beneath the hawthorn tree. He had never forgotten before. The iron side gate was locked. She called his name through the bars. Nothing answered except rooks stirring among the chimneys. Rosalie followed the stone wall until she found the narrow opening Everett sometimes used when his father entertained guests, then slipped through and crossed the dew-heavy lawn. Every curtain was drawn. The stable doors stood open. 2 wagons waited near the front steps while servants carried trunks from the house without their usual conversation. Something was wrong. Rosalie approached an elderly groundskeeper she recognized. "Where is Everett?" The man stiffened. "You should go home, Miss Bennet. He said he would meet me." "Not today." "Then tomorrow." The groundskeeper looked toward the house. His expression changed in a way Rosalie was too young to understand. "There will not be a tomorrow here." Before she could ask what he meant, a carriage rolled from behind the stable block and disappeared down the northern road. Rosalie ran after it until the gravel gave way to mud, but the carriage was already beyond the trees. She never knew whether Everett had been inside. For 3 days she returned. On the 4th, the Whitmore house was almost empty. Paintings had been removed from the walls, leaving pale rectangles against faded wallpaper. Furniture stood beneath white sheets. Even the clocks had been taken. Rosalie wandered no farther than the entrance hall, frightened by how completely a house could lose its life while still standing. Then she noticed something near the bottom of the stone staircase. A dark brown stain marked the edge of one step. Beside it lay a small brass button bearing the Whitmore crest. Rosalie picked it up. She had seen the same buttons on Everett's dark traveling coat. "Miss Bennet." She turned. A woman stood at the end of the hall, dressed plainly in gray. Rosalie recognized Mrs. Hale, Everett's former nurse. Her face looked exhausted. "You must leave." Rosalie closed her fingers around the button. "Where did Everett go?" Mrs. Hale hesitated. "Away." "Where?" "I cannot tell you." "Did he want to go?" That question silenced the woman. Rosalie's childish certainty began to fracture. "Please tell him I came," she whispered. Mrs. Hale approached and knelt so their eyes were level. "Listen to me carefully. Whatever you hear about the Whitmore family, remember the boy you knew. People will say many things when money and inheritance are involved. Most of them will know nothing. Will he come back?" Mrs. Hale looked toward the empty staircase. "I pray that he does." Within a week, rumors spread across Cumberland. Adults lowered their voices whenever Rosalie entered a room. She heard fragments through doors, disputed inheritance, missing documents, debts, disgrace. Everett's father had supposedly lost control of the estate. Another relative had assumed authority over portions of the Whitmore holdings. No explanation ever remained the same for long. Rosalie asked her uncle, Charles Bennet, what had happened. He was standing beside the library fireplace when she showed him the brass button. For one terrible second, all color left his face. "Where did you get that?" "At Everett's house." Charles took the button from her hand. "You are never to return there." "Why?" "Because the Whitmores are gone. Everett promised he would meet me." Her uncle's expression softened, but fear remained behind his eyes. "Some promises are made before people understand how cruel circumstances can be." He placed the button inside his desk drawer and locked it. Rosalie never saw it again. Weeks became months. She wrote Everett 6 letters. None received an answer. The following spring, the Whitmore estate was sold, and the hawthorn tree became inaccessible behind newly repaired walls. Eventually Rosalie stopped walking the northern road. She grew older. Childhood surrendered to responsibility, and responsibility to loss. Yet sometimes, on quiet evenings, she remembered gray eyes beneath summer branches and wondered whether Everett had forgotten her. He had not. Far from Cumberland, the boy carried her blue ribbon through every unfamiliar house, every lonely winter, and every year in which the name Whitmore was spoken as something diminished. What Rosalie could not know was that Everett remembered more than her promise. He remembered the night his family fled. He remembered his father sealing documents by candlelight. And he remembered one name spoken in the room before they departed. Bennet. 18 years changed Briar Glen more gently than they changed Rosalie. The orchard still covered the sloping Cumberland hills behind the house, row after row of old apple trees bending beneath autumn winds, but the stone walls had darkened, the roof required repairs after every hard winter, and several acres once belonging to the Bennet family had been sold to keep the remaining land free of debt. Rosalie was 27 now. Her chestnut hair was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, her childhood restlessness tempered into quiet endurance, yet something of the girl who had crossed a mile of wet grass for a lonely boy remained untouched beneath the years. She lived with her widowed aunt, Margaret Bennet, and managed much of Briar Glen herself. 2 poor harvests had left their accounts painfully thin. Rosalie knew the price of flour, coal, roof slate, horse feed, and pride. Pride, she had discovered, was often the most expensive. On the morning after the gathering at Harrogate Hall, she stood beside an orchard window holding a letter she had already read 3 times. Her aunt watched from across the breakfast table. "You have been staring at that paper for 10 minutes. It is an invitation." "From whom?" Rosalie hesitated. "Alderwick House." Margaret slowly lowered her teacup. The name seemed to alter the room. Beyond the windows, rain moved like grey silk across the fields. "The Duke? His household is receiving several neighboring families on Friday." "And you were invited personally?" Rosalie looked again at the black seal. "Apparently." Margaret studied her niece with the careful concern of a woman who had survived enough disappointments to distrust unexpected attention. "What happened last night?" Rosalie could still hear the Duke's voice. "A promise." 2 words had disturbed memories she had spent years teaching herself to ignore. "Nothing I understand." That afternoon she walked through the orchard alone. Fallen apples lay among the wet grass, their red skins shining beneath the cloudy sky. From the northern ridge, she could see farther than she had as a child. Beyond nearly 6 miles of hills and dark woodland rose Alderwick House, the Duke's restored residence, built from grey stone high above Blackmere Lake. It was not the abandoned Whitmore home of her childhood. That estate had passed through other hands long ago. Alderwick belonged to Everett's ducal inheritance through a distant branch of his family, a fact Rosalie had learned only that morning from her aunt. Everett Whitmore. She whispered the name once, testing it against the memory of an 11-year-old boy beneath a hawthorn tree. The powerful man at Harrogate could not possibly be him. Yet she had seen the scar. She had seen his eyes. And he had spoken of a promise. By Friday evening, a carriage carried Rosalie along the narrow road climbing toward Blackmere. The lake appeared between the pines nearly 200 feet below, black beneath the approaching dusk. Alderwick House stood above it with tall windows glowing amber against the stone facade. Beyond the eastern wing lay the broken arches of an ancient monastery, pale beneath the moon. Inside, the house was warmer than its exterior suggested. Dark oak. Brass lamps. Deep green carpets. No excessive display of wealth, only the unmistakable confidence of a place that no longer needed to prove its importance. Everett stood near the library fireplace when Rosalie entered. He was speaking with an older gentleman, but his gaze found her immediately. Again, that strange stillness. Again, the feeling that everyone else in the room had disappeared for one silent heartbeat. He excused himself and approached. "Miss Bennet." "Your Grace." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You came. You invited me. Those are not always the same thing." Rosalie met his eyes. Then perhaps you should tell me why you did. Everett regarded her for several seconds. You were always impatient. Her breath stopped. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said always. Before she could answer, a servant announced dinner. Everett stepped aside, but his hand moved briefly toward the pocket inside his coat. Rosalie noticed the gesture. She noticed everything now. During dinner, she heard fragments of conversation about Everett's years abroad, the estates he had rebuilt, the influence he had gained, and the fortune he had apparently multiplied rather than merely inherited. Everyone seemed fascinated by what Everett had become. Rosalie found herself wondering what had happened to the boy he had been. Later, while the other guests gathered around the piano, she discovered Everett alone beside a tall window overlooking Blackmere. "Why did you return to Cumberland?" she asked. His reflection met hers in the dark glass. For a moment, he looked tired rather than powerful. "There are questions here that were never answered." "About your family?" Everett turned toward her. The warmth disappeared from his expression. "About why we left." Rosalie felt the room grow strangely cold. "And have you found your answers?" "Not yet." His gaze settled on her face. "But I know where to begin." Miles away, inside the locked desk that had belonged to Charles Bennet, an old brass button still rested beneath 18 years of forgotten papers. Rosalie did not sleep well after returning from Alderwick House. Everett's final words followed her through the dark rooms of Briar Glen, quieter than thunder, and somehow more difficult to escape. He knew where to begin. She could not dismiss the way he had looked at her when he said it, as though the answer he sought stood not in some distant archive but somewhere dangerously close to her own family. By morning, cold rain had settled over Cumberland. Rosalie spent several hours reviewing orchard accounts with her aunt, yet numbers blurred beneath her eyes. At noon she finally closed the ledger. "Did Uncle Charles ever know the Whitmores well?" Margaret Bennet's hand stopped above her sewing. "Why are you asking?" "Because Everett Whitmore has returned." Her aunt's face changed. Not dramatically. That made it worse. "So you know who he is?" I remembered. Margaret lowered the fabric into her lap. "Your uncle rarely spoke of that family after they left." "Rarely is not never." Before Margaret could answer, wheels sounded on the gravel outside. A servant entered moments later carrying a cream-colored envelope. Rosalie recognized the black seal immediately. The message contained only a few formal lines. Everett requested permission to call at Briar Glen that afternoon. At 3 o'clock, his carriage appeared between the rain-dark apple trees. He arrived without ceremony, wearing a charcoal coat beaded with water. Wealth had taught Everett elegance, but it had not softened him. Rosalie met him in the drawing-room, where a small fire struggled against the damp October chill. "Your Grace. You used to call me Everett." Her heart stumbled. There it was. No more uncertainty. "Then it is you." He studied her face. "You truly did not know." "I knew a boy. I met a duke." Something almost painful moved through his expression. "I suppose 18 years can make strangers of anyone." "Not entirely." Rosalie's eyes drifted to the scar along his cheek. Memory opened with startling clarity: summer grass, an old hawthorn, 2 stolen apples, a silver watch. "You still have it." Everett became motionless. "Have what?" "The watch." Slowly, he reached inside his coat and drew out a silver pocket watch. Age had softened its shine, but Rosalie recognized the engraved edge before he even opened his hand. Around the chain was a narrow strip of blue silk. Faded. Frayed. Still there. Rosalie forgot the rain. She forgot the cold room. For one suspended moment, she was 9 years old again. "You kept the ribbon." "I kept the promise." His voice was quiet. Rosalie looked up. "Everett, we were children." "I know. I did not understand what I was promising." "I know that too." There was no accusation in his answer, which somehow made it heavier. He closed the watch gently. "Do you remember why you gave it to me?" "Because you thought no one could ever want you." Everett glanced toward the window. Rain traveled down the glass behind his reflection. That was part of it. Rosalie stepped closer, though several feet remained between them. What was the rest? You were the only person who looked at me without first looking at this. He touched nothing, yet she knew he meant the scar. Everyone else saw something damaged. You saw Everett. Rosalie's throat tightened. I still do. His gray eyes returned to hers. The Duke disappeared for a heartbeat. The lonely boy beneath the hawthorn stood there instead. Then the walls rose again. That is precisely why I wish you had remembered sooner. Rosalie frowned. Why? Everett placed the watch back inside his coat. Because I did not return to Cumberland for a childhood promise. The warmth left the room. Then why did you return? My father spent his final years believing our family had been deliberately ruined. Before he died, he gave me records he had managed to preserve. Letters. Account books. Names. Rosalie felt an uneasiness she could not explain. What names? Everett's gaze settled on her with terrible calm. One appeared more often than the others. She already knew before he spoke. Charles Bennet. Rosalie stepped back. My uncle? Yes. He was an honorable man. Perhaps. You do not believe that. Everett's jaw tightened. I believe evidence before memory. Rosalie stared at him, caught between the boy she had once trusted and the man now questioning everything her family had been. Outside, the rain strengthened against the windows. Then why come here? She whispered. Everett looked toward the hallway leading to the old library. Because 18 years ago, your uncle locked something inside a desk after you brought it home from my family's abandoned house. Rosalie went still. A small brass button. She had not thought of it in years. Everett saw recognition cross her face. You remember? Yes. His voice dropped. Then whatever happened to my family may have left something behind at Briar Glen. Rosalie led Everett toward the library without speaking. Briar Glen seemed different with him inside it, as though the old house remembered something she did not. The corridor smelled faintly of beeswax and damp stone. Rain whispered against the tall windows, and somewhere behind the walls an old pipe clicked with the patient rhythm of a clock. Charles Bennet's library had remained largely untouched since his death 7 years earlier. Margaret disliked the room, and Rosalie had never questioned why. Books crowded dark shelves from floor to ceiling. Heavy curtains softened the afternoon into twilight. At the far end stood the walnut desk Rosalie remembered from childhood. Everett stopped when he saw it. That one? Yes. Rosalie crossed the room and touched the brass handle of the lowest drawer. Locked. My aunt may have the key. Wait. Everett moved closer, studying the desk rather than Rosalie. Your uncle kept papers here? Accounts, letters, estate records. Most were never sorted. Then do not disturb anything until we understand what we are looking for. Rosalie turned sharply. You came to my home because you believe my uncle helped destroy your family, and now you are asking me to be patient? Everett met her anger without raising his voice. I am asking you not to mistake suspicion for certainty. You already have. No. His answer came quickly. If I had certainty, I would not be here asking questions. The words silenced her. Everett looked toward the rain-dark window. My father spent years assembling fragments of what happened. Contracts disappeared. Creditors appeared almost overnight. Property changed hands through agreements he insisted he never authorized. By the time anyone listened, our name had become synonymous with failure. Rosalie remembered adults whispering behind closed doors. And Charles Bennet appears in those records? Repeatedly. Doing what? Witnessing transactions. Carrying correspondence. Meeting with men connected to the transfer of Whitmore property. Rosalie folded her hands to keep them from trembling. That proves he was involved. It does not prove why. Everett's gaze returned to her. Something changed there. Respect, perhaps? Exactly. She had expected accusation. Instead, he had given her room to defend a dead man. That kindness made the distance between them more painful. When did you decide to come back? She asked. Everett was quiet for several seconds. 3 months ago, I found a letter among my father's papers. It had been written the night before we left Cumberland. By whom? My father. What did it say? Everett reached inside his coat, but this time he did not take out the silver watch. He produced a folded sheet protected inside a leather case. Only part survived. The final page is missing. Rosalie read the visible lines. Her eyes paused on one sentence. Charles Bennet knows where the original documents were hidden. Beneath it, another line had faded almost beyond recognition. Trust no accusation until you know who profits from it. Rosalie looked up. Your father trusted my uncle. At least when he wrote this. Then why did you say my family might have ruined yours? Everett's expression hardened, not against her, but against himself. Because I spent 18 years believing the simplest version of the story. That Charles betrayed him. Yes. And you came here prepared to hate a dead man. I came here prepared to discover whether I should. Rosalie returned the letter. What about me? Everett did not answer. Did you come prepared to hate me too? The question remained between them, fragile and dangerous. His eyes moved toward the blue ribbon hidden beneath his coat. That would have made everything easier. Rosalie's breath caught. Everett stepped away before the silence could become something neither was ready to name. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Margaret entered carrying a small iron key. She looked from Rosalie to Everett, then toward Charles's desk. I wondered when this day would come. Rosalie stared at her. You knew? Margaret crossed the room slowly. Your uncle made me promise never to open that drawer unless a Whitmore returned to Briar Glen asking about the past. Everett became perfectly still. Margaret placed the key in Rosalie's palm. He said the truth would be safer if everyone believed it had disappeared. Rosalie inserted the key. The lock resisted, then turned with a dry metallic click. Inside lay bundles of letters, a ledger wrapped in cloth, and a small brass button she had found 18 years ago. Beneath them rested an envelope bearing Charles Bennet's handwriting. Across the front were 5 words that changed Everett's face completely. For the son of Whitmore. Everett did not reach for the envelope. For several seconds he simply stared at Charles Bennet's handwriting, and Rosalie watched 18 years of certainty begin to loosen behind his eyes. Margaret quietly left the library and closed the door, giving the past to the 2 people who had inherited its consequences. Open it, Everett said at last. Rosalie broke the brittle seal. Inside were 3 letters and a folded page covered with columns of dates, payments, and property names. The first letter was addressed to Everett's father. Charles had written that he believed someone inside the Whitmore family was manipulating estate accounts and arranging transfers through intermediaries. He warned that several signatures might have been copied without proper authorization and urged Everett's father not to confront anyone until the original ledgers were secured. Rosalie looked across the desk. He was trying to help. Everett remained silent. She opened the second letter. It had never been sent. Charles described a meeting with a solicitor who had discovered that money from disputed Whitmore properties had passed through 3 holding companies before reaching an account controlled by Lord Malcolm Whitmore, Everett's father's older cousin. Everett's face hardened at the name. You know him. He became my guardian after my father's health failed. Rosalie lowered the letter. The man connected to these transfers raised you? For 4 years. The words were almost without emotion, which made them colder. Everett walked to the window. Beyond the glass, rain had softened the orchard into gray shadows. Malcolm told me your uncle betrayed my father. He said Charles supplied creditors with private records and helped force the estate into ruin. And you believed him. I was 11. Rosalie felt the answer strike somewhere tender. Of course he had believed the adult who controlled what remained of his world. Children accepted explanations because they had no power to investigate them. She unfolded the third letter. This one was different. It was addressed to Charles Bennet in a woman's elegant hand. Everett turned before Rosalie spoke. He recognized the writing immediately. My mother. Rosalie handed it to him. Everett read slowly. His composure changed line by line. His mother thanked Charles for hiding copies of the original estate documents, and warned him that Malcolm had begun asking servants about missing papers. She wrote that Everett's father intended to expose the scheme once the family reached safety, but illness and financial pressure had made immediate action impossible. Near the bottom was a sentence that caused Everett to sit down. If my son ever returns to Cumberland, tell him his father was not betrayed by the Bennets. Tell him Charles tried to save what remained when others had already chosen profit over blood. Silence filled the library. Rosalie had imagined vindication would feel triumphant. It did not. It felt like grief arriving 18 years late. Everett placed the letter on the desk with extraordinary care. I hated your uncle. He never knew. I did. His voice dropped. That is enough. Rosalie sat opposite him. You were given a lie when you were a child. You carried it because someone made certain it was the only story available to you. Everett looked at her, and for once there was no duke in his expression, no practiced distance, no authority. Only exhaustion. Malcolm is still alive. Rosalie understood immediately. Does he know you are investigating? He knows I returned. He does not know what I have found. She examined the page of financial records again. One property name appeared repeatedly beside Malcolm's initials. Alderwick Timber Company. The dates continued years beyond the Whitmore family's departure. Everett, these payments did not stop when your father left. He leaned closer. Rosalie traced the entries. They continued for almost 12 years. Everett's eyes narrowed. Which means this was never merely about forcing my father from one estate. It was about controlling everything attached to the Whitmore inheritance. Beneath the ledger lay one final folded sheet they had overlooked. Rosalie opened it carefully. It contained a list of document locations written by Charles. Most had been crossed out. One remained untouched. Original transfer deeds, East Wall, Old Library, Briar Glen. Rosalie looked toward the shelves. The East Wall. Everett followed her gaze. They moved together to the far side of the room, where a tall bookcase stood against dark wood paneling. Rosalie noticed a narrow seam behind it. With effort, they shifted the bookcase several inches. A small recessed compartment appeared in the wall. Inside rested a flat wooden box. Everett opened it. Dozens of original documents lay beneath a layer of dust, each bearing seals, signatures, and dates. At the very top was a letter in Malcolm Whitmore's unmistakable hand. Everett read the first line, then stopped. Rosalie saw the truth in his face before he spoke. This proves it. Outside, the rain finally began to weaken. But far across Cumberland, at another estate where the evening lamps were already being lit, Lord Malcolm Whitmore received a message informing him that the Duke of Alderwick had spent the afternoon at Briar Glen. By the following morning, the rain had passed, but the truth it uncovered remained over Briar Glen like a storm that had merely changed its shape. Everett had taken none of Charles Bennet's papers away. Instead, he summoned his solicitor from Carlisle and instructed him to examine every document at Briar Glen in Rosalie's presence. It was a small act of trust, yet Rosalie understood its meaning. Everett would not allow another generation to decide the truth behind closed doors. By noon, the evidence formed a pattern too precise to dismiss. Malcolm Whitmore had used intermediaries to acquire properties connected to Everett's father while directing suspicion toward Charles Bennet. The original deeds proved that several transactions had been altered after Charles witnessed earlier versions. Charles had hidden the authentic papers, waiting for the day a Whitmore might return capable of using them. Everett stood beside the library window while his solicitor finished reading the final ledger. This is sufficient to restore your father's reputation, the man said, and to challenge several transfers made under Lord Malcolm's direction. Everett did not smile. Rosalie had learned that victory rarely looked like triumph on a man who had spent 18 years paying for it. Proceed quietly, Everett said. No public accusations until every record has been independently verified. The solicitor gathered his notes. There is another matter. Lord Malcolm has already begun asking questions about Miss Bennet. Rosalie looked up. About me? Word has spread that His Grace has been visiting Briar Glen. Some are suggesting the Bennet family concealed Whitmore documents for personal advantage. Everett's expression became cold. Charles preserved evidence that protected my family. Society rarely waits for evidence when gossip is more entertaining. After the solicitor departed, silence settled over the library. Rosalie walked to the window. Beyond it, the orchard glowed beneath weak autumn sunlight. Briar Glen cannot survive another scandal, she said. The bank reviews our remaining loan in December. I know. She turned. How? I made inquiries. About my finances? About anything Malcolm could use against you. Rosalie should have been offended. Instead, she heard the concern beneath his careful tone. And what did you find? That 2 bad harvests have placed this estate in danger. Everett approached the desk. I can settle the debt today. Rosalie's spine straightened. No, Rosalie. No. His eyes narrowed slightly. You have not even heard the terms. That is precisely why I am saying it now. For one heartbeat, the boy beneath the hawthorn seemed to return in the surprise on his face. You think I would demand something from you? I think 18 years ago I made you a promise, and now you are standing in my failing house with enough money to save everything. Everett went completely still. Rosalie regretted the words the instant they left her, but she would not withdraw them. He reached inside his coat and removed the silver pocket watch. The faded blue ribbon rested around its chain. You believe I kept this as a debt? I do not know what you kept it as. Everett looked down at the ribbon. For years it reminded me that once, before titles and estates mattered, someone had seen me and decided I was worth choosing. His voice remained steady, but something beneath it had broken open. I never expected the child who made that promise to spend her adulthood paying for it. Carefully, he untied the ribbon. Rosalie watched the faded silk slide free after 18 years. Everett placed it in her palm. You were 9 years old. I release you from every word you said beneath that tree. Rosalie closed her fingers around the ribbon. And Briar Glen? I will protect your uncle's name because the evidence proves he deserves it. I will prevent Malcolm from using false claims against this estate because justice requires it. But your debt remains yours unless you freely ask for my help. You would do all that and ask nothing? Everett looked at her with a sadness deeper than anger. There is one thing I wanted. Rosalie could barely breathe. What? For you to choose me when you were old enough to understand what choosing meant. He stepped back. But if I must use your fear, your gratitude, or your family's need to obtain that choice, then I would rather never have it. That evening Everett left Briar Glen before sunset. Rosalie stood beneath the stone archway watching his carriage disappear between the apple trees. In her hand lay the blue ribbon she had once tied around a lonely boy's watch. For 18 years Everett had carried her promise. Now he had returned it. And only after becoming completely free of it did Rosalie understand that losing the promise felt far more painful than keeping it. Rosalie understood before midnight that freedom could ache more deeply than obligation. She placed the faded blue ribbon beside her lamp, extinguished the flame, and lay awake listening to the autumn wind move through the apple trees. Everett had asked nothing of her. That was what made the truth impossible to avoid. Gratitude could be repaid. Debt could be settled. A childhood promise could be released. But love, once recognized, demanded an answer freely given. At dawn, Margaret found Rosalie already dressed. Where are you going? To finish something I began 18 years ago. The old Whitmore estate had changed hands twice since Everett's childhood, but the northern boundary remained largely untouched. Rosalie rode nearly 4 miles through pale morning mist before leaving her horse beside the old stone wall. The narrow opening she remembered had been sealed long ago, yet a newer gate stood several 100 feet away. Beyond it, the hill descended toward the place where the hawthorn tree had once sheltered 2 children from a world neither understood. The tree was still there. Barely. Half its crown had been lost to winter storms, and one great branch rested close to the earth, but the trunk remained rooted beneath the Cumberland sky. Everett stood beneath it. A dark traveling coat covered his shoulders. His horse waited nearby with saddlebags fastened behind the saddle. Rosalie stopped. "You are leaving?" Everett turned. Surprise broke through his guarded expression. "For London. The evidence must be placed before my solicitors and the trustees overseeing the disputed estates." "And Malcolm?" "He will be given the opportunity to answer what the documents prove. Publicly if necessary." There was no satisfaction in Everett's voice. He had wanted justice, Rosalie realized, not revenge. "Will you return?" she asked. His gaze moved toward the hills. "I had not decided." Rosalie stepped beneath the hawthorn. For a moment neither spoke. 18 years seemed to gather around them. 2 stolen apples, summer grass, a silver watch, locked gates, unanswered letters, and all the winters that had carried them away from who they had been. Rosalie opened her gloved hand. The blue ribbon lay across her palm. Everett stared at it. "I gave this back to you." "I know." "Then keep it." "I cannot." His expression tightened. "Rosalie, you owe me nothing. That is why I came." She moved closer. "When I was 9, I promised to marry you because I thought marriage meant sharing breakfast and saving someone the best apple. I did not understand loneliness. I did not understand loyalty. I certainly did not understand love." Everett said nothing. "You were right to release me from that promise." His eyes lowered for an instant. "Then there is nothing more to say." "There is everything more to say." He looked at her again. Rosalie's voice softened. "The child who made that promise did not know what she was choosing. The woman standing here does." The wind stirred the ribbon between her fingers. "I do not choose the Duke of Alderwick. I do not choose your estates, your title, or the protection you could give Briar Glen. I choose the boy who remembered kindness when the world taught him suspicion. I choose the man who returned seeking justice and stopped when the truth contradicted his anger. I choose Everett." For the first time since his return, Everett seemed to have no defense. Rosalie held out the ribbon. "I made a promise before I knew what love was. I make it again now because I do." Everett slowly removed the silver pocket watch. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as Rosalie tied the faded ribbon around its chain once more. The knot was imperfect, just as it had been 18 years earlier. Everett looked down at it and laughed softly, the sound carrying across the empty hill. "You still cannot tie it properly." Rosalie smiled. "Some things should remain familiar." He lifted his eyes to hers. "And if I ask you again when there are no debts, no investigations, and no ghosts standing between us?" "My answer will still be yes." By spring, Charles Bennet's name had been publicly cleared, and the Whitmore records restored the truth of Everett's father's affairs. Malcolm withdrew from public life after the trustees ruled against the disputed transfers. Briar Glen survived through a successful harvest and a new business arrangement Rosalie negotiated herself, refusing Everett's money and accepting only his advice. They married beneath the old hawthorn when its first white blossoms opened. There was no grand ballroom, and no crowd gathered to admire a duke. Only family, a few trusted friends, and an old silver watch carrying a faded blue ribbon. Everett's scar remained exactly where it had always been. Rosalie never wished it away. Years later, whenever their children asked why such an ordinary ribbon was kept among the family's most precious things, Everett would smile at Rosalie before answering. "Some promises endure not because they bind us to who we were, but because time finally teaches us why our hearts made them."